Prou conegut i reconegut al món, també molt admirat a casa nostra el professor Etzkowitz, el president de la Triple Helix Association, segur que l'heu sentit anomenar, Research and Fellow i director també de la Càtedra de Gènere de Stanford University. Ens oferirà avui, com acostuma, una altra classe magistral sobre el que és la seva experiència, en aquest cas en la Càtedra de Gènere de la Universitat de Stanford. Professor, thank you very much. Welcome to Barcelona. Welcome to the forum. We'll just sit down and listen to your words. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You want to do it here?
Sure.
Wherever.
Here. Okay.
Sure.
Okay. Well, very good to be here again in Barcelona. I'm sometimes asked, what is a man doing studying women in science? How did you get into this topic? And I have different answers to that, but the one I'd like to tell you about today is my mother. She graduated with high honors in geology from Hunter College, a women's college in New York City during the 1930s depression. And I'd always thought that the reason she didn't pursue a career in geology was because of the economic depression, that there were no jobs. But then, when I was on a research trip and I visited the University of Texas at Austin to the engineering department, I saw this wall of recognition. Distinguished professors who had graduated during the 1930s depression and had pursued careers in geology. So that made me think there might be other reasons than the economic depression as to why a woman would not pursue a career in science at the time. So this afternoon, I want to talk to you about imbalancing lives, or balancing lives. We can read it either way. The gender dynamics of science and technology. So the outline for the talk is as follows. I will talk first about a past study done in the 1990s in the United States, sponsored by the National Science Foundation, of women's experience in academic science in the United States. And I think one of the implications to draw from this study is that in Europe and in other countries now, there's a strong move to introduce the American system of higher education, including tenure procedures, which basically put a very strong emphasis on early achievement, which, as we shall see, has implications for women. As you'll see, I suggest there's a contradiction between the tenure clock and the biological clock. And so Europe and other parts of the world may want to think more carefully before introducing this system, which is now taken as the gold standard in higher education. But maybe it is not. Secondly, I'll discuss a project that was done when I moved from the States to Europe, to Newcastle University. We did a 4-country study sponsored by the European Union, DG Research, on women in technology transfer. And this study followed a bit from the previous one in that during the previous study, when we were interviewing women in academic science, some of them would talk about colleagues who were no longer in the department. They were now in jobs elsewhere. And outside of the study, I followed up and interviewed some of these women who were pursuing careers in journalism, in museology, and so it seemed that some of the women who were leaving academic science were taking up careers in science-related professions. And it was this finding that inspired the study sponsored by the European Union of women in technology transfer. And then third, we'll discuss a model that we developed from that study called the Vanish Box, after the old magic trick of disappearance of women and then reappearance. So the Vanish Box model. And then finally, we'll raise the question of gender revolution, stalled or moving. Okay, so, well, this is the commercial. This is the book that resulted from the first study, Athena Unbound, The Advancement of Women in Science and Technology, with my co-authors, Carol Kemmelgore and Brian Uzi, published by Cambridge University Press. Still available. Okay, so the first basic issue or underlying theme that you can identify in the issues of women in science is the relationship between status and gender, a historical relationship. If you look at the development of scientific disciplines, the development of new disciplines, you'll find often a very strong participation of women in the early stages of development of the new discipline. But as the new area becomes prestigious and the rewards increase, women seem to disappear from those fields and men enter them. And by the time the Nobel Prizes are being awarded, it's the men who are there and the women are no longer to be seen. This is based not on our research, but on historical studies of classical genetics and other early fields in the early 20th century. And so one of the questions we want to raise is this historical relationship between gender and science still hold today, or has it changed? But this was the historical relationship. You could find women in the fly room. This was the place where they studied Drosophila genetics at Columbia University in the early 20th century, headed by Thomas Morgan. There were large numbers of women working in that research group. But as the field became prestigious, the women disappeared from classical genetics. So, gendered inequalities in academic careers. Now we're moving to findings from the Athena Unbound study, which was over 400 in-depth qualitative interviews conducted at a dozen universities, leading research universities in the United States in 5 disciplines, ranging from biology to physics, chemistry, and well, here is the US model of academic hierarchy, what we call front-loading in the academic career. In other words, a strong emphasis on youth and achievement in the early years, partly based on a mistaken idea that youth are more productive in science than people who are at an older age. And that finding was documented by Professors Merton and Zuckerman in a study that they did of aging and age structure in science. They found that productivity was as high or even higher at the later stages of a scientific career. And after all, that makes sense. When you're more advanced in your career, you have more access to resources, more graduate students, more research associates, more people working with you. And as we know, co-authorship comes not only from the work you do yourselves, it comes from having the members of your research group being highly productive. So, nevertheless, there's still a strong belief that youth makes the scientific advances. And so this has been the basis of a system in which there's a strong emphasis on early achievement. During the first years of your career, there's this race for tenure, to accumulate enough publications and research grants in order to be given a permanent position in an American university. In Europe, the tradition has been once you're hired, there's a probationary period, and then you continue on to be promoted or not. But in the States, there's this very sharp dividing line. It's more or less an up or out system. So the implications for women is what we came to call the contradiction between the tenure clock for 7 years and the biological clock, the time when it's possible to have children. And these coincide. And so women had to make the choice to postpone having children till after tenure, which then becomes mid or late 30s. So there were some women who didn't want to postpone. And so some of them rethought their commitment to academic science and left for that reason. Occasionally at some universities there has been some reform of these procedures, an attempt to accommodate women by extending the clock. In other words, you could apply for a year extension to reduce your time in order to have more time for the children. But there's even a contradiction in that, because women are concerned that if they apply for this privilege, that it will be looked against them in the final review. That you have to show that you are fully committed, racing the clock, otherwise it will be held against you. So even the attempted reform still has its dangers. At least the women feel that they may be given points off for taking advantage of even this attempt to change the rules. So the contradiction between the tenure clock and the biological clock. And I think the most important finding from all these specific elements that we came across was that the most important thing holding back women's advance in academic science was inflexibility of rules and procedures. And it didn't matter what the specific procedure was. If it was one way in one country, for example, in the US, it's expected that once you finish one level of education or training, that you will move from one university to another, that you should pursue your PhD at a different university than your undergraduate degree. This is the highest route, that you're supposed to move from one school to the other. And if you stay in the same place, that's not considered the best way to go. On the other hand, well, and what's the consequence of that? If a woman has a relationship, well, either the man moves or she has to leave the relationship. How many people are willing to do that? Not too many. And so if the man moves and the woman goes along, she may then have to take a school that's not as good as the one she otherwise might have gotten into. So this rule of exogamy works against women. On the other hand, in Sweden, the rule is the opposite. Instead of saying you should move from one university to another, the rule is that you should stay at your own university. That if you are a highly successful scholar, you will be kept within that university. I recall interviewing a Swedish professor, and he said to me, "Why would I send my best graduate student away? He's going to replace me when I retire." So the rule in Sweden is endogamy, that you stay within one university. Again, if a woman's partner moves and she moves with him, well, that will work against her career because she has left her university of origin. So whichever way the rule is, if it's an inflexible rule, it has more negative consequences for women than for men. So the important finding here is to increase flexibility in the system. In one interview that we did, a professor talked about a leading student of his who stayed in the same city and took a job at a local teaching college. But an exception was made for her because she was such an outstanding scholar that she was then brought back to this leading university in the same city. and allowed to pursue a career at that university. That was an exception to the rule. But because it was seen that the rule was counterproductive to the best use of talent. But in this case, it was an unusual exception, but one that could be more regularly made if we're thinking of how to revise the system. Some other fun, the 2 out of 3 time bind to advancement. Whether it's in the United States or in Mexico or other countries, because we extended the study by, whenever I was traveling, I would do interviews with researchers on women in science in whatever country I visited. And so, if you were trying to do 3 things, most women found this was too much. So they could do advanced research in a highly productive way, and their family relationship, but that didn't leave time for spending time in local politicking, schmoozing, talking with people, which is the way towards advance within the academic system. So they could advance in their research and scholarly career, but not in the career that would lead to becoming a chairperson or an administrator within academia. So the 2 out of 3 time bind. Then I think we can see overall, traditionally there's been a sexual separation of labor. The sociologist Emil Durkheim called it a division of labor. But basically it means that men work with men and women with women in gendered occupations. Some people think that these occur as a basis of naturally occurring gendered divisions. But historically, we can see that these gendered occupations change over time. I did my master's thesis on the male nurse, titled The Precarious Identity of the Male Nurse. But the nursing profession in the 19th century was entirely men and began to change over to a female profession by the end of the 19th century, and by the middle of the 19th century, it was almost entirely female, and the male was an anomaly in that profession. So that is what you can find in that gendered professions historically change over time. But what would a gender-neutral occupation be? It would be one with flexibility in the role and with a balance between on-site and off-site work, and the possibilities of equal participation of both genders in the occupation. And this is what we began to see happening in our next study of technology transfer as an emerging science and technology occupation. So, the leaky pipeline versus the vanish box. The pipeline has been the notion of looking at the movement of children on up through schooling, into higher education, and into careers. The notion that there should be a flow through this pipeline. And if there was, and you then recruited young people, young women, that over a period of 20 or 30 years at maximum, women should be at the highest level of any occupation. And this recruitment has taken place. Girls now make up equal numbers in bachelor's degrees, and the numbers are moving up in the PhDs. But they have not moved up at the same rate at the highest levels, at the associate and full professor levels. So the pipeline has not worked by itself, just by filling it at one end and expecting a changed result at the other. So more impetuses are needed and changes in order to make the pipeline work. So the pipeline leaks, women leave. But where do they go? What happens to women who, for one reason or another, don't continue in an academic career in science? This was the question that we posed in starting a study Women in Science and Technology, sponsored by the European Union. Our basic finding was that we could identify women who had left academic science but were reappearing in science-related professions. And they were using their scientific skills and also networking and social skills in these new professions. And technology transfer was opening up as a field in Europe in the 1990s. In the UK, for example, in the mid-1990s, the size of the profession doubled. And when these opportunities opened up, large numbers of female PhDs were available to move into this profession and took the jobs and moved up. And the same thing was happening in the States. And so women rose to the top of technology transfer profession, were heads of leading offices at major universities. One phenomenon that took place was that as women rose to leading positions, they were concerned that the status of the field might decline because it was dominated by women. And so they tried to recruit men to the field in order to keep the status of the profession high. And so one question is, what happens in this event? We presented some of these findings to the Association of University Technology Managers in the United States. And while I was at the meeting, I talked with a colleague who was one of those early women who had risen to a high position in technology transfer as head of the council, the legal office at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And she had been president of the association. But she remarked to me that there had not been a woman head of the association in 5 or 6 years. And we inquired into why. And it seemed that the position had become more strenuous, requiring a lot more travel, but also it had become more prestigious and more competition for it. And men were putting themselves forward. And although people in the association thought of themselves as being completely gender neutral, by not paying attention to the topic, in effect, women were moving outside, were no longer in the highest positions. And I raised this issue with an old friend and colleague who had become president of the association, because we were also trying to do a study of the association. And when we called up to find out if they had data on gender, the answer was no. On their basic membership form, they were not collecting that basic data. And so I asked my colleague, Ashley Stevens, why don't you have gender? And he said to me, why would we? If someone comes to us with their technology, whether man or woman, we'll do the best job for them. So with that ideology, even though it's a seemingly gender-neutral attitude, what it does by not recognizing the issue of gender means that it leaves room for implicit distinctions to be made without taking the situation fully into account. So the people in Autumn, being of goodwill, they changed the procedure, and they also recently elected a woman as head of Autumn again. So maybe that's a practical consequence of our research. Well, from this study of women disappearing and reappearing from academia to science-related professions, we developed a model that we call the Vanish Box that takes place in 4 stages. The first is the disappearance of women. The disappearance that we found in the Athena Unbound study from the exclusionary practices or just the taken for granted male model of science which did not take account of women's needs, of women's life chances, and lifestyles. And so they weren't found at the highest levels of academic science to the extent that would be expected if the pipeline was working as it was supposed to, with women flowing in and being promoted up over a period of time. So disappearance. And then, where are they? Well, in the reserve army, at home or in part-time positions, unemployed or underemployed. And the reserve army is called back when there's an emergency or a shortage. So during World War II, women, PhDs who'd been unemployed or working as volunteers in their husband's laboratory, they were called into full-time positions. And you found them working in the Manhattan Project to develop the atomic bomb. And then after the war, some of them began to get academic positions and rising to the highest level. But they were there in the reserve army. And so the third phase of the model is the creation of new opportunities, either by emergency situations or by the creation of new professions that require people with scientific training. And so the example of that was the technology transfer profession that we studied. A new profession that required people with scientific training and background and also business training. And typically, people with a scientific background would learn the business skills, take courses, or even a master's degree in business. So this provided opportunities. But there are still limitations. The new profession wasn't as prestigious as the old one. And so it had both advantages and disadvantages. Working in technology transfer office, there's more of an opportunity for a work-life balance, but the prestige of the profession isn't that high, and the opportunities for advancement are limited. On the other hand, as the knowledge society advances, professions that translate knowledge into use become more prestigious. So the profession also rises in status and prestige over time, and that is what has been happening with technology transfer. And so the question that arises is, will it follow the same model as classical genetics, or will it lead to a new model of a gender-neutral profession with both men and women working at the highest levels and in a situation that allows work-life balance? There's some evidence that this may be happening in small biotechnology firms. A study done found that women recruited into these firms were taken seriously in their work, they were being promoted, and so the startup biotechnology firm has also offered evidence that there may be a changing relationship and new possibilities available in this area. So finally, we ask, is there a gender revolution in science, technology, and industry? Is it stalled or is it moving? For the past 20 years now, there's been a thesis put forth, most recently by the American sociologist Cecilia Ridgway, of a stalled revolution. That is, in the 1970s, large numbers of women entered professions in law and medicine, but more recently it's argued that this advancement of women has halted. The pay differentials continue. They have not risen to positions in boards of directors of firms to the same extent that might be expected. So the thesis of the stalled revolution. On the other hand, there's evidence of continued advance of women. Women now make up a majority in a number of countries of bachelor's degrees recipients. Over 50%, in some places as high as 60%. 40 years ago, the percentage of women attending the Massachusetts Institute of Technology could be counted on the fingers of one hand. Today, half of the undergraduate students at MIT are female. That is a major change. Once you get to the level of 20%, social relations within organizations start to change. But they don't really transform until you get to the 50% level. That has now occurred at this institution. Also, the rise of women as technology entrepreneurs. Yesterday, I heard a presentation of a project sponsored by the city of Barcelona to train women as entrepreneurs. What struck me in that presentation was a relatively small percentage of the women in that program were in service occupations. Typically, in women's entrepreneurship, the service occupations, hairdresser shops, things like that, make up the majority. But in this group, the majority of the women were in science and technology-related occupations. And I talked to the person running the program, and she told me the key issue that she's working with those women is how to grow their firms and still retain a work-life balance. So here in Catalonia, there's a major change going on in female entrepreneurship that is taking place in scientific and technological occupations to a larger extent than elsewhere. So the revolution is moving here. And we can see that work-life balance issues are being taken seriously in technology firms. In the Triple Helix group at Stanford, we work together with the Anita Borg Institute, which is an organization named after a computer scientist who worked for Hewlett-Packard in the 1980s and 90s. She established a listserv for women in industry to discuss their common issues. And then later this organization was created after she passed away to continue her work. And basically, it encourages and advises corporations on how to improve the situation for women's work-life balance within companies. Flexible work time, and we saw that there's a similar project here in Catalonia, in which firms in science parks both have instituted some of these procedures on their own and are also being advised how to improve the situation further. But the most interesting example I have of this is a talk that I once went to by a woman from IBM, speaking to the computer science PhD students at Columbia University. And she said to them, "Why would you people want to have a career in academia? The situation is terrible." Basically representing some of the things that we found in the Athena Unbound study. He said, "Come to work in IBM. We see that you get to take time off when you have children. You can continue working in your group, come in part-time. We will do whatever is necessary to allow you to continue your career." And indeed, last year, IBM was the winner of the Anita Borg Award for the corporation showing the most progress. And most recent evidence is that a woman is now head of IBM, who rose in the research and business ranks in the company. Okay, so work-life balance is changing. And so, although our findings from the 1990 study of academia, the pessimism there still holds. Academia is still the most resistant to change. What became embedded as a male model of science has been thought to be the way that science should proceed, and the only way that science should proceed. But we know from our research that female academics have worked out a female model of doing good science, of not spending the endless hours in the lab. And when you come to interview the male scientists in the lab, you'll see them with their feet up on the desk, reading the newspaper. The laboratory has become a club for many of them. So the women keep to 9 to 5 hours and pursue their work. But the problem is, that's looked down upon. You're not considered to be a real scientist unless you're spending 100 hours a week or more in the laboratory, whether you're actually working or not. So there's still a lot to do in reforming academia, but business has been moving faster, and academia now has to learn from it. That will be the final stage in making this gender revolution in science and technology. Thank you.